Hi, PerspectiveWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Monday, January 11th. Looks like a relatively quiet weather pattern for much of the eastern part of the nation over the next few days, kind of dry and chilly conditions. There was a low pressure system over Texas this weekend that produced some decent accumulating snow that far to the south across Texas, and that system will weaken as it pushes to the north and east today into the Carolinas and then ultimately out over the western part of the Atlantic Ocean. It does look like a colder weather pattern is shaping up for the second half of January for much of the northern U.S. and it really may get underway at the end of this week with the passage of a strong cold frontal system that will move from west to east across the north central U.S. and then the Midwest and Great Lakes and into the eastern U.S. Friday night time frame. And again, that kind of will usher in a colder weather pattern for the second half of the month of January. Of course, they have had some severe cold and some extreme snow across the North Pole in Asia and Europe. Probably have heard about Spain, for example, had their lowest temperature ever recorded late last week, and then a major snowstorm hit places like Madrid. The biggest snowstorm there in 50 years. They've had some extreme cold in China. Beijing, for example, had the coldest temperature in 50 years there, and very cold conditions, extreme cold in Japan with some tremendous snowfall as well. And a lot of that can be attributed to a stratospheric warming event. We've been talking about this for really a couple of weeks now. It got underway earlier in the month of December, continues now, although it's kind of relaxing, and it looks like there may be kind of a rejuvenation of a stratospheric warming event as we progress through the second half of January. And again, colder weather pattern will set up across the U.S. for the second half of January. That could extend all the way into the early part of February. This is a loop of the past 30 days with respect to temperatures at the very top of the atmosphere. We're talking about the 10 millibar level, stratospheric level. Anything above this line right here, this represents 60 degrees north. So what we're looking at here is a significant stratospheric warming that has taken place over the last 30 days. This is a day-to-day loop over the past 30 days that goes all the way to January 8th. And again, red indicates a substantial warming taking place in the polar regions between 60 degrees and 90 degrees north over the last 30 days, and that certainly is playing a role in some of the severe cold and even the extreme snow we're seeing across the North Pole, in Asia, parts of Asia, and parts of Europe. And again, there are signs that another kind of a reinforcing or a rejuvenation of a stratospheric warming event will take place during the second half of January. Well, speaking of Europe, this is the forecast map of total snowfall in Europe over the next 10 days. And last week, of course, there was a tremendous snowstorm, one of the worst in 50 years, central Spain, Madrid area, and that is after just a day or two after they experienced some of the coldest temperatures ever recorded. The snow over the next 10 days will kind of shift across Europe. UK may get hit hard, Scandinavian countries, including Sweden may get hit very hard. Could even be some very significant snowfall all the way down to the southern part of Europe, places like Italy and Greece. And why do I care? Why do I show what's going on in Europe? Oftentimes, with stratospheric warming events, the severe cold and even the snow can hit places like Europe and Asia before it actually impacts the U.S. So this is something we're keeping an eye on. And of course, it can be a cold air source as well, with cold air possibly coming across the North Pole from the Asian side of the pole into the North American side of the pole. Again, overall weather pattern looks colder and colder as we progress through the second half of January for much of the northern U.S. Well, let's take a look at the 500 millibar height anomaly forecast map from last night's ensemble run of the GFS at 6Z. And I just want to point out some interesting changes that will be taking place across North America, especially like the western part of Canada, western part of the U.S., that again will allow for a colder weather pattern to set up. It will allow for the transport of some very cold air bottled up in Canada recently to make its way all the way into the northern part of the U.S. First of all, notice as we start off the week here, early Monday morning, we have kind of a trough impacting Alaska and the west coast of Canada. Now watch what happens as we go through this week into the end of the week, into the middle part of the month of January. Here we are now midweek, and then just keep an eye on what happens here by the latter part of the week. This is now the Thursday forecast map. Notice now we've gone from a trough out across the western part of Canada to ridging. Ridging on this particular type of map is shown in orange. That's higher heights compared to normal. And you can see a nice ridge popping up across the western part of Canada. By the time we get to the end of the week, it kind of relaxes for a while, but then it returns in full force. And here we are now over the upcoming week, and this is the forecast map for Sunday, January 17th. Very interesting look to this overall pattern. First of all, we have high latitude blocking. This is typical of a stratospheric warming event when temperatures really warm up at the stratospheric level over the polar regions, as it has done over the past few weeks. That generally leads to an increase in pressure over the high latitudes. And what we're seeing here is very high pressure over places like northern Canada, Greenland, by the upcoming week in the middle part of the month of January. This is a high latitude blocking, and that allows for the transport of some cold air from the high latitudes to the middle latitudes. Sometimes the transport of the cold air masses initially goes to the other side of the pole, or the middle latitudes of Europe and Asia. Madrid, by the way, for example, has a latitude of 40 degrees, the same as Philadelphia. And then ultimately it makes its way across the other side of the North Pole, and the North American side of the North Pole. This is a pretty cold looking pattern for much of the eastern half of the nation. An upper level trough setting up here over the upcoming weekend. High latitude blocking here across Canada and northeastern Canada and Greenland, and this ridge continues here. Notice this flow of air that will allow for the movement of air masses from way up in Canada into the central U.S., and that could spill eastward into the eastern U.S. So we have this high pressure ridging across the west coast of Canada and the U.S., a deep upper level trough setting up over the eastern half of the nation, and high latitude blocking to the north, and that spells a change in the overall weather pattern across the northern U.S. in coming weeks. Well, let's take a look at another way to look at the upcoming significant changes for the northern half of the nation in the next couple of weeks. Again, the second half of the month of January, kind of beginning with this weekend, really see a pattern change to much colder conditions across the northern U.S., and that includes the mid-Atlantic region, the northeastern U.S. This is actually the ensemble run 850 millibar temperature anomalies for the current 5-day period, and well above normal across the northern U.S. and Canada, with colder than normal conditions across the southern U.S. Again, just experienced an unusual significant snowstorm across Texas over the weekend. That low pressure system will tend to die out as it moves to the Carolinas today and then out into the western Atlantic. But this is the current 5-day period. Let's just push forward here. These are rolling averages over 5-day periods. This is the next 5-day period, days 2 to 6. Then let's keep progressing farther and farther into January. And look at the change here as we go to days 6 to 10. What was much above normal across the northern U.S. and Canada, flipping to below normal, and that extends all the way down into the southeastern part of the nation. Let's go even farther out and look at this, all the way days 8 to 12, 9 to 13, finally days 10 to 14, and we're talking about January 20th to January 25th. So we go from this type of pattern in the current 5-day period to something like this, according to the ensemble run of the GFS, by the third week of the month of January. So some big changes coming, and that will continue if we go out a little farther in time, and this is the farther south. The ensemble run of the GFS goes days 12 to 16, January 22nd to 27th. Could be some very, very cold air, at least in parts of the U.S., and colder than normal extending all the way across the northern U.S. A real flip in the pattern from what we're experiencing right now. Well, let's wrap up by looking at the operational run of the GFS at 6Z and the surface forecast maps. Here's that storm system as we begin the new week here Monday morning. Caused some significant accumulating snow across Texas. It'll tend to weaken as it heads towards the Carolinas later today. The upper air energy just gets sheared out. It was well intact as that storm system crossed the southern U.S. and earlier last week it looked like this system could threaten the mid-Atlantic region with some snow, but it no longer appears that that will happen. It tends to weaken and stays to the south as it heads towards the western Atlantic, and then relatively dry, chilly, quiet weather pattern across much of the eastern half of the nation for the next few days. And then we start looking upstream, and here comes that cold frontal system by Thursday, cutting across the Midwest and northern plains, and it charging its way towards the eastern U.S. Here we are by Friday morning. Here's the area of that surface cold front as of Friday morning, heading into the eastern U.S. And this it may become quite an active frontal passage. We'll have to monitor this threat over the next few days. We're talking late Friday night time frame as it arrives near the eastern seaboard. This is the surface map for Friday evening. Again, it could become kind of an active frontal passage here at the end of the week. Maybe some rain or snow showers, maybe even a little bit more than just snow shower activity here. We'll have to monitor this. And the cold air does come in. Not a major shot of cold by Saturday, but a kind of definitely a colder shot of air, and it changes the overall weather pattern to one of colder, persistently colder for the second half of the month of January. And then by the time we get to the early part of next week, we'll have to monitor possibility of something developing in the southeastern part of the nation. Again, we'll have that upper level feature, kind of an upper level trough. The GFS is kind of poo-pooing any threat for the early part of next week. Here's the forecast for a week from now, next Monday. But again, I think we'll have to watch. We'll have to monitor this time period, really from the weekend all the way through the early and middle part of next week. Something may develop not only along the initial frontal passage, but maybe a couple of days later, the early part of next week. We'll have to monitor this time period. We'll kind of move forward a little bit, and there's a whole other cold air mass that's starting to set up across the northwestern part of the nation, and that too works its way into the northeastern part of the nation as we progress through the month of January. Here's another cold frontal system for the third week of the month of January. So some changes occurring across the northern U.S. Really getting underway this weekend, but for the second half of the month of January, it looks like a colder and colder weather pattern for the northern U.S., and that change in the weather pattern could become active as well and could last into the month of February. So that's it for now. For PerspectiveWeather.com, I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.